Welcome to I Got Stuck, a catalog of temporary obsessions, with me, your host, Dr. Kelly Reedy, wherein each week I'll give you a full report on the latest topic that's kept me up at night. Things that have led to countless hours of procrastination through Googling, asking Jeeves, and navigating the twistiest and turniest of internet rabbit holes. By the way, pairs of rabbits have been known to groom each other's faces. Today, I want to talk about old-timey medicine. I'm one of those people that wouldn't actually want to travel back in time because I wouldn't want to deal with the medical practices of any time in the past. It's pretty mind-boggling to think about what people did and thought before people knew better. And of course, what are we doing now that somebody will say that about in 100 years? That question's too scary, so I want to instead give you some horrifying moments and ideas from old-timey medicine, mostly in the ballpark of like 100 to 200 years ago. So buckle up and clutch your modern medicine tightly. Let's start in the mid-1800s. Let's say you've got a fussy baby. Maybe it's teething, maybe it's just generally agitated or not sleeping. What's a normal thing to do now for that? I honestly have no idea. I don't think I even know any babies. But if I had to guess, I would guess that there are probably lots of specialized medicines for different problems that babies have now, and it takes some thought and experience to figure it all out. But back between the 1840s and the 1930s, things were easier. There was one obvious solution, a cure-all, if you will. It was this magical stuff called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. This was a medicine for babies by babies. Nah, this was a medicine for babies invented by two pharmacists in Bangor, Maine in 1845. The story was that the mother-in-law of one of those pharmacists used to be a nurse, and when she was a nurse, she found a formula that seemed to kind of fix everything. A lot of people seem to think that the pharmacists themselves just invented this medicine and used Mrs. Winslow for marketing purposes. It definitely helped with things like teething pain, diarrhea, and sleep problems, but it was often marketed as a general cure-all. Here's some copy from a Mrs. Winslow's ad. For children teething, greatly facilitates the process of teething by softening the gums, reducing all inflammation, will allay all pain, that was all caps, and spasmodic action, and is sure to regulate the bowels, all caps. Depend on it, mothers. It will give rest to yourselves and relief and help to your infants. All caps. Sold by all chemists. So, what is this magical elixir that does all these things? It's alcohol. But wait, there's more. Alcohol was only the second ingredient in the soothing syrup. The main ingredient? Morphine. Now's a good time to mention that Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup eventually earned the nickname the baby killer. This stuff was heavy duty. Now, we know that a teaspoon was enough to potentially kill a child, and the recommended dose for children over 6 months was 3 to 4 teaspoons per day. But in the 1800s, people didn't know that. Mothers saw incessant marketing and ads, probably word-of-mouth stuff too, and they trusted it. Because, it didn't not work. One mother wrote into the New York Times saying that the effect it had on her son was, quote, like magic. He soon went to sleep, and all pain and nervousness disappeared. End quote. Forever? That's what we're all thinking, right? People did start to find out how dangerous it was, and by the 1860s, pharmacists were being taken to court over Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. By the way, and we know this from a court record, but Mrs. Winslow's claims to have sold 1.5 million bottles per year, as recorded in 1868. It's estimated that thousands of babies died from this syrup, but there's no official record. Overdoses must have happened all the time, and also morphine addiction and morphine withdrawal can, of course, be deadly. One thing that's important to keep in mind here is that the people selling these medicines had it made, because morphine is, of course, really addictive, and people build up tolerance over time and need larger and larger doses to get the same effect. So you had thousands of babies losing their little minds when they weren't high on morphine, and then all the moms and the nannies had to give them even more medicine to soothe them. So it was all a pretty terrible and sadly familiar cycle. Mrs. Winslow's carried on selling their soothing syrup despite all this until the U.S. passed the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, which made it so that ingredients had to be listed. Also, under this act, they had to remove the morphine from the syrup and take the word soothing out of their product name. Another guy doing a similar thing at a similar time was Mr. James Cook Ayer, who was the most successful patent medicine guy of his time. He patented a bunch of really similar medicines under different product names, and he made insane amounts of money off of them, specifically around $20 million. And this is because he invested really heavily in his advertising, just like the Mrs. Winslow's people did. J.C. Ayer had a bunch of products, including one for babies, one for hair revitalization, one for ague, whatever that is. Most of it was some version of that good old-fashioned morphine and grain alcohol combo. J.C. Ayer ran for Congress in 1874 in Massachusetts, and he lost. And the main reason he was cited for losing was his, quote, cold manner. People were so against him getting elected that he kind of lost his mind and got violent, and he was sent to live in a mental institution in New Jersey, where he died in 1878. Fun fact, the town of Ayer, Massachusetts, near Boston, is named after him. And I hardly ever say fun fact, so that's a really big deal. That is a pretty fun fact. Okay, so people eventually learned that morphine is useful when it's used sparingly, but otherwise, it's dangerous. It's highly addictive, and it probably shouldn't be given to babies in large doses. So could people just come up with something a little safer and a little less addictive, maybe? The Germans were on the case. The chemists at Bayer Pharmaceutical were looking for a safer version of morphine. So they distilled it. They boiled morphine for a few hours, and they wound up with diacetyl morphine, which pretty much could be used medicinally the same way as morphine, and was even more potent because it was distilled morphine. Turns out other people had figured this out before, but Bayer were the first ones to learn how to easily make it and commercialize it. So they're the ones that got to name it. They decided to name it based on the German word that I don't know if I'm pronouncing right, but it's spelled like heroisch, which means heroic or strong. And it, of course, became known as heroin. They started selling it in 1898 as a cough syrup, both for adults and children. Back then, you could even buy heroin and needle kits from the Sears catalog. But what if you decided not to go the heroin route to cure your cough? Well, may I suggest chloroform? I don't know about you, but when I think of chloroform, I think of those scenes in movies where a bad guy uses a rag soaked in chloroform to knock somebody out for a while. But before that, it was used as a cough syrup. Chloroform was used in the U.S. in cough syrups and toothpaste, among other things, until it was banned in 1976 when it was shown to cause cancer. 1976, y'all. By the way, the concoction that Healthline calls the mother of all dangerous cough syrups was a mixture called one-night cough syrup. It was called that because it was supposed to knock out your cough in one night. It was sold over the counter, and its ingredients were, I hope you're sitting down, its ingredients were alcohol, cannabis, chloroform, and morphine. So, chloroform for coughs, but if full-blown asthma is what's troubling you, and you're taking advice from a mid-1800s doctor, try smoking tobacco in addition to taking chloroform to draw morbid activity from your lungs. Asthma cigarettes had a heyday around then, with Cigar de Joy being the main brand. Later on, other types of asthma cigarettes popped up that had lots of herbs and leaned more towards folk medicine cures. So that's a little bit about how people dealt with minor complaints in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Basically, just throw some opium at whatever ails you. But what about more serious stuff, like cholera and chlamydia and even the bubonic plague, aka the Black Death? Now we understand disease better, and now we use the germ theory to understand how disease spreads. But it took humans a long time to figure that one out. Which is understandable, considering that microbes weren't even discovered until 1676, and they were discovered accidentally by a haberdasher named Antony van Leeuwenhoek that I bring up every single chance I get, I will definitely tell you more about him in a later episode. Anyway, one of the theories of how disease spread before we learned about germs was the miasma theory, also known as the bad air theory. In 1674, the scientist Robert Boyle wrote a little book about it with a title that I have to share with you. It was called Tracts Containing Suspicions About Some Hidden Qualities of the Air. The word miasma comes from the ancient Greek word for pollution. And the general idea here is that stink causes disease. If somebody had the plague, for example, that person would be releasing their bad air into the world while they were sick, and anybody who breathed it could then also catch the plague. Side note, for a period of time, this went beyond disease, and it extended to other stuff. For example, the idea that if you smelled food enough, you could gain weight. People believed the miasma theory until the late 1800s, and that was when germs were discovered. Miasma was blamed for the big cholera epidemic in London in the 1800s and for a lot of disease in the early days of New York City. Europeans settled initially in Lower Manhattan, and when they started getting sick, miasma filled downtown as the bodies piled up, and that was one of the reasons people started to move uptown. But honestly, whether or not miasma spread disease, I don't blame them for wanting to move out of the stinkiest financial district in the history of New York City. And that is saying a lot. But I want to focus on the plague. There were 3 plague pandemics and other epidemics, but for long periods of time, the Black Death was totally ravaging Europe. It killed nearly half the population. Nobody fully understood it, but a big theory about it involved miasma. So the plague doctors wore masks to keep the bad air out of their noses. That makes sense. That checks out. That's what we do now, right? But for a different reason, in a way. Remember, the idea here wasn't that germs spread through the air. The idea here was that if you smelled something nasty, you might get infected just from smelling that smell. So the name of the game here was not to keep air out, it was to keep stink out. So plague doctors wore elaborate costumes. I'm sure you can picture the look, the robe, the cane, the beak, the wide-brimmed hat. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go look up an illustration of a plague doctor right now. And by the way, there was no purpose to the wide-brimmed hat that I could find. It was just what doctors wore to be fashionable. But let me give you a tour of the rest of the getup. First of all, they would wear a robe as their top layer, and underneath the robe, they wore thick leather. So that was like their hazmat suit. The cane functioned as a social distancing stick. They could use it to poke stuff while staying far away from the patients that they were treating. But the beak is mostly what I want to talk about. Why were the beaks so big compared to the types of masks we wear today? It was because these beaks needed storage space. They would stuff them full of strong-smelling things like herbs and garlic and fragrant oils, and sometimes even full sponges that had been soaked in vinegar. Anything to totally dominate the smells the doctor was smelling so that they wouldn't smell any of the bad air. So doctors were pretty safe in terms of miasma theory stink avoidance. But what about regular people? Not everybody had a plague doctor mask to wear. The Great Plague of London happened in 1665 and 66. Here's what regular people were doing. They would trap and save intense smells that they encountered, and then they would unleash those smells and breathe them in when miasma rolled into their neighborhood. This was a real thing that real doctors really recommended. There were 2 popular and common methods. One, which is significantly cuter, and I think probably easier, was to get a stinky pet goat to keep your home covered in good, solid stink year-round. The other method was to fart into jars. I've seen this referred to as stink therapy. Store farts in jars and then sniff those farts when disease comes into your area. Fight fire with fire, because if you're smelling farts, you can't smell the stink of the plague. Okay, so people thought bad air caused problems, but there was another common culprit in the old-timey medicine realm. If it wasn't bad air, maybe it was bad blood, or maybe even just too much blood. For thousands of years, and going back to at least ancient Egypt, people thought that if you were sick, it's because you had a blood problem. If you had bad blood, the obvious solution would be to get it out of your body as fast as possible. So the practice of bloodletting was common across a huge swath of time and space. It's over 3,000 years old as a practice. And it was considered to be pretty legit until the 1900s, at which point the general consensus was quackery. The other thing I mentioned that caused problems in this system was too much blood. Not just bad blood, but too much blood in general. But again, the solution was to get it out. There was this medical theory that Hippocrates was a big proponent of, that the human body had 4 main components called humors: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And the goal was to have the right balance between all those wonderful substances. When something went awry health-wise, blood was usually blamed for being out of balance. And they always, for some reason, assumed there was just too much of it. Until, of course, there wasn't. How would a doctor know when enough blood had been let out? When the patient started to faint. That would usually signal the end of the session. And yes, a lot of people died in that way. So if you had a cough, you might go to a doctor and get your vein cut open to drain some of that extra blood out. There were even medical diagrams which said where to make cuts to draw blood for particular ailments or complaints. Or you might be into preventative medicine and get some light blood draining done with your haircut and shave, because lots of barbers offered bloodletting as a service. I mean, hey, they've got razor blades. You're already sitting down. Might as well, right? And by the way, a lot of people had the job title of barber surgeon in the Middle Ages. For that reason, like, hey, they've already got knives and razors, might as well make the barber a one-stop shop. So bloodletting was used to treat physical ailments for sure, but one French doctor had a further recommendation. Jacques Ferrand wrote a book in 1623 about using bloodletting to cure heartbreak. In this case, you take a person who is, quote, plump and in good health, and then drain their blood almost to the point of actual literal heart failure. Ta-da! Some patients miraculously cared less about that unrequited love after Jacques Ferrand got his hands on them. Another method of bloodletting that was a little less painful, but maybe a little more squirm-inducing, was through the use of leeches. Leeches became really popular in the 1800s as an alternative to cutting. And I shouldn't talk about them in the past tense because they're still used today for medical purposes. The use of medicinal leeches was approved by the FDA in 2004, but only for certain things, like microsurgeries. But I don't want to get into leeches. That's a whole other story. What if, stick with me here, what if health problems aren't caused by bad smells or bad blood or by having too much blood? What if the problem is the brain? Without further ado, I want to briefly mention 3 old-timey medicine brain treatments before wrapping this thing up. First up, trepanning. That is, drilling a hole in somebody's brain to relieve pressure. This treatment goes back to at least 6,000 BC, and it was used for thousands and thousands of years. It was thought to cure a ton of different stuff. But, it leaves the patient with a big old germ hole. This one is obviously bad and horrific, a drill being drilled into a brain. But what if you did a similar thing in a somewhat safer way? A way where you don't even have to drill into the skull. Maybe you take advantage of pre-existing holes in the skull that lead to the brain. And thus, we come to brain treatment number 2, the ice pick lobotomy, which is actually not even that old-timey. It was practiced up to the mid-1900s. They did this by sticking basically a fancy ice pick into somebody's eye socket, popping the end of that with a hammer, and poking the brain. All done in less than 10 minutes. And sometimes they'd use electroconvulsive shock before the ice pick part to get the patient unconscious. Since there was no drilling involved, pretty much anybody could do this, i.e., you didn't need to be a surgeon. So ice pick lobotomies were alarmingly common. And did the ice pick lobotomy work as a way to adjust somebody's behavior? Absolutely. It more or less turned people into zombies, making them totally out of it and sometimes totally paranoid, and rightfully so, I think, for the rest of their lives. By the way, the guy who invented this, a doctor named Walter Freeman, used to travel around the country doing ice pick lobotomies as theater, often for rooms of doctors who would throw up and or pass out while watching. And the right-handed Dr. Freeman sometimes did his ice pick lobotomies left-handed when he was feeling kinda cocky. These were called ice pick lobotomies because Walter invented this procedure by using an actual ice pick on a dead body. Enough about that. Moving on to brain treatment. Number 3, a spinning chair. Which doesn't sound as bad as those other two, but I don't know. Still not great. This was an idea that was first studied by Charles Darwin's grandfather Erasmus in the 1700s, who was, I'll say, not very good at science. He had this idea that if you spin people around fast enough in a chair, they'll eventually go to sleep. And sleep cures everything. In the early 1800s, a doctor named Charles Cox really leaned into this spin doctor thing and built several types of chairs that he hung from the ceiling. They could spin around at 100 times per minute. And some of these chairs could hold up to 4 people at a time. Spinning in these chairs was used mostly to treat psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia, so they were often found in mental institutions. He reported very common side effects like vertigo attended by pallor, nausea, and vomiting, and frequently by the evacuation of the contents of the bladder. But the upside here is that the spinning chair stuff led to more detailed studies of vertigo a little down the road. And I think that's enough old-timey medicine for me today. From bad air to bad blood to bad brains. What a journey. I'm going to cut it short here before I give you any more nightmare fuel. So this is where I'll leave you. Until next time, stay curious, appreciate modern medicine, and don't trap farts in jars. But do get a stinky goat. Definitely get a stinky goat. This theme song was written and recorded by Clark Blomquist.